Welcome to our sporting planet. What I hope we've convinced you of today is that the sport industry is well and truly in the middle. Sport is bridging the gap between its digital and its physical worlds, between its past and its present, perhaps between its head and its heart. What I hope to speak about for the next 20 minutes or so is the idea that on yet another level, our industry finds itself in the middle. Specifically, the middle of a transition from an industry that was inherently local in nature to one that is truly and deeply, legitimately and comprehensively global in scale and its nature. Because historically, sport by definition was local. It was a local thing. We had to service and address local audiences. We had to fill out our stadiums by selling them tickets. We had to prioritize domestic broadcast revenues because they were the backbone of our commercial model. All this is changing. Today we address genuinely global audiences using the media technology that's now available to us. We do business and sell rights to organizations all around the world. So sport is genuinely global. And it's my conviction that as this new normal becomes increasingly embedded and entrenched, that sport, and specifically sports rights owners, will have the opportunity for structural growth and genuine scale like never before. And what the data tells us is that as global demand for leisure and sport and entertainment go up, for reasons that I'll talk about, and as sport sees the uniqueness of its appeal relative to other entertainment increase, what we'll see is a recalibration, a redistribution of emphasis and value away from sporting communities or sporting cities or sporting nations and towards something that I think we might quite credibly call our sporting planet. So the first question we have to ask is, what does a globalized sport industry look like? What will it mean for sport to exist in a globalized world? And to answer that, I'd like to think first of all about demand for leisure, the demand side of our global leisure economy, of which sport is, of course, one part. And I think if you look here, there are many good reasons to expect and project and count on structural underlying growth. And I'd like to tell you about 4 of those reasons now. Firstly, there'll be more humans, which, to be fair, is pretty good news for the demand side of most markets. But stick with me. The world population won't go up forever, this much we know. But in the next 10 years, this decade of the new 20s, we'll see our number go up from the 7.7 billion we are today to some 8.4 billion by 2030. This growth won't be uniformly distributed across continents and across countries, of course, but through a combination of fertility and immigration, most countries in the world will see the number of people living within them go up. If the current incidence of sports followership and sports fandom is upheld, and actually we have good data to believe that it might go up, but even if it remains consistent with today's levels, what this will mean is some extra 500 million sports fans in the world, which of course is great news for those of us in the business of finding and engaging and monetizing them. So there'll be more people. Those people will have more money. There are lots of problems in the world that we're not doing a good job of solving, but absolute poverty isn't one of them. By historical standards, we're doing a phenomenal job of pulling people out of destitution and into a global middle class of sorts and unlocking the lifestyle and cultural benefits and sensibilities that go with that. The rather blunt metric of average global GDP per capita will go up by some 22% in the period in question. Not all of this will flush through into spending on leisure, but if we conservatively model what that might look like, there's good data to suggest that the average human's leisure budget will go up by some 5% ahead of inflation. So we have more people and more money. We'll live closer together. By the end of the next decade, approaching 2/3 of us will live in urban spaces of some sort. Why does that matter? Well, historically, cities are the world's hotspots for the exchange of goods and services and ideas and experiences. physical proximity to other humans is a great arbiter of our ability and our propensity to discover new things, to try new things, to adapt and indulge. So it stands to reason that experience industries like sport are set to be buoyed as we create more experience interchange than ever before by living closer together. Fourthly, and perhaps most importantly, we'll have more time at our disposal. It might not feel like this to lots of us, lots of the time, but each year that passes, we unlock more of our waking week to invest in things that we like doing, that we enjoy doing, that we care about, and we reduce the necessary investment of time into things that we have to do, that we need to do to stay alive or to maintain our current position. And this will happen by some 20% over the next decade, more leisure time. To explain this, I wanted to share a couple of stories, actually. The first is about a guy called Dhruv. Dhruv is a close friend of a colleague of mine. Dhruv lives in the suburbs of Mumbai, in India. And Dhruv is part of the first generation in his family that can afford a washing machine. I've spoken to Dhruv a few times this year. He estimates that fact alone, just the washing machine, gives him some 10 hours a week more disposable leisure time than his parents would have had at the equivalent point in their lives. And that's just the washing machine. That's before we even think about a car or a refrigerator or eventually a smartphone or a home assistant. As you can see, Dhruv's a big cricket fan. He spends a healthy chunk of that extra 10 hours a week watching and consuming sport and creating extra value for the sponsors, broadcasters, and ultimately the rights owners in the Indian sports industry. This is not just a developing world thing, though. On the other side of the planet, I wanted to introduce you to a guy called Mike. I met Mike at a conference this year, last calendar year, in fact, the last 12 months. Mike's 64. He lives near San Francisco. And he, too, told me an anecdote that crystallized in my mind this idea that with each year that passes, we're uncovering more of our waking week to invest in the things we care about. Mike proudly told me the story of how he'd synced up his Alexa home device, home assistant, to his Amazon Go account. And he started, tentatively at first, ordering groceries from the comfort of his sofa in his home. That extra 1, 2, 3 hours a week that he saves by virtue of not having to go to the supermarket, clearly not on the scale of the leisure time that Dhruv's unlocking, or someone like him. But to a busy person in a Western economy, an extra couple of hours a week can feel like a hell of a lot. And Mike told me that he spent a lot of that extra time during the football season watching the NFL online. And as you can see, this is a photo of him playing senior softball, which he's taken up and now plays with his co-workers. So all around the world, we have these vignettes. We have more people, we have more money, we have more time and therefore more attention, and we have more higher propensity to exchange ideas and experiences. Demand for leisure in the world will go up because it can't not. It will structurally go up. So you might be sitting there wondering, why sport specifically? Surely everything I've mentioned so far relates equally to movies and to music and to TV and to literature and art and theatre, and you'd be right. Everything I've mentioned does relate to those things, but there are a number of quite fundamental reasons that I'm convinced, and we at Two Circles are convinced, that as all this extra value is pumped into the global leisure economy, sport is disproportionately well placed to realise the upside. So I thought I'd share a couple of those reasons with you now. Firstly, sport thrives through unpredictability, while other media thrives through homogeneity. What do I mean by that? Well, most forms of entertainment in the world, commercial entertainment, are trending over time towards sameness. They're getting narrower. They're becoming more repetitive and more formulaic, repetitive expressions of the same handful of creative ideas. These were the top 50 highest grossing films at the global box office last year. 42 of them were prequels, sequels, remakes, adaptations, or spin-offs, or franchise entries. 42 of the top 50. I like film as much as the next guy, but it does seem there's a dearth of original creativity at the very top of our global movie industry. There's some fascinating publicly available data, incidentally, about the repetitive nature of commercially successful music. Over time, commercially successful top 40 music is getting more repetitive in its lyrics and in its backing tracks. Sport, of course, is cyclical. There's no denying that. But with each year that passes, we see new heroes emerge. We see new formats of our games, new types of experience, new types of attendance experience, new demographics. So it seems to me that as other forms of media and other forms of entertainment trend more and more towards satisfying that part of the brain that craves familiarity and certainty and predictability, sport has this unique opportunity to be our outlet for uncertainty, to service our deep biological desire to be surprised, for diversity, for new things. And I think sport's increasingly unique in its ability to do that. Secondly, sport, I would argue, more than other forms of leisure and entertainment, alleviates many of the problems that go along with modern living. So one of the great ironies of living in a world that is developing and urbanizing and economically modernizing is that some of humanity's worst problems get worse as we do so. So things like obesity and anxiety and social detachment. It's clear to me that on almost every one of those markers, sport is a direct force for good rather than a force for neutrality or for bad. That's not something I'm convinced you can say for all forms of leisure. The obvious physical benefits of sport aside, sport is proven time and time again, study after study, to improve our mental health, both in and of itself and through our cooperation and relationships with others. Sport also, I think, enriches our cultures. It brings our societies and our communities closer together. We share in the narratives around sport. We share in the cultural meaning of sport. I don't think all leisure pursuits achieve quite the same outcomes. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, sport has an increasing monopoly of live attention. So what you're looking at here are the top 100 most viewed US broadcast events in 2011. Blue represents live sports event coverage, and grey is non-sport. 49 of the top 100 US broadcast events that year related to live sport. So already a pretty healthy market share. Fast forward to last year, that number had gone up to 92. 92% of the most watched live broadcast experiences were sport. Sport has a growing and tightening monopoly over live attention, live consumption. I think this matters for lots of reasons. There are commercial implications, obviously. This is pretty good news for sponsors and advertisers and broadcasters that go around sport, and ultimately for the rights owners who provide the content. But I think there are other less commercial implications of this, or at least less overtly commercial implications, that are just as important. Think about what it means to experience something live. By definition, to consume something live is to share an experience with another human being, in space or in time. So as sport has this increasingly monopolistic relationship with live consumption, what sport's basically doing is developing a controlling share in our ability to form shared, resonant, cherished experiences and memories with other people. Who among us doesn't have a cherished memory of watching a tense penalty shootout in our living room with our family? Of watching a tense set point in the pub with our friends? These moments, these memories define us. They help us figure out who we are and who our friends are. They shape us over time. This, to my mind at least, is the most significant thing that sets sport apart from other forms of leisure, as we will see extra demand come into the market in the next 10 years. I wanted to share another story. This is a woman called Abanar, who we met via an online focus group this year. She was comfortable that I share some of her story with you today. Abanar lives in Ghana, near Accra, the capital. And Ghana's a part of the world that's been seen rapid increase in access to broadband in recent years, household broadband. And as such, Abanar and women like her, people like her, are experiencing for the first time a genuinely globalised media ecosystem. So speaking to Abanar, she told us that in recent years she'd discovered Scandi noir crime drama and British sitcoms and Hollywood blockbusters, and importantly, a renewed breadth and depth of Western sport. And what was really interesting was that when probed about which of those things she was most pleased to have discovered or which she would miss the most if it were taken away, sport was the unequivocal answer. And in particular for her, basketball. Why? Because sport, and basketball in this case, was the only thing that Abanar and her family sat down to watch together. Everything else, all those other things she's discovered, they watch in their own time, on demand, on disparate devices in different rooms in the house at different times of day. Sport has this centralizing and unifying quality that brings us back together in a media landscape that seems on a lot of fronts to be nudging us apart, to consume things separately in our own time. I think sport's ability to do that and the value that that creates can't be underestimated. So a good question to ask at this point is, what role will the internet play? So as we start to see with stories like Abanar, it's changing what we consume as well as how we consume. It's worth thinking at this point about where internet adoption is today. As of 2019, global internet penetration stands at some 56% of all individuals in the world. We passed 50% a few years ago, and we will surpass 60% in the next few. My contention is that 60% will represent a more important threshold than 50% for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. What I think is interesting to reflect upon, though, is that in the next decade, by the time we reach 2030, we will all but finished have connecting the world's population. Almost every human being on the planet will be wired into this global interchange of ideas and experiences. That's a world that none of us have lived in yet. And I think it's interesting to reflect on what a world like that might look like. My fourth story today is about a woman called Ying. Ying did voluntary work with a good friend of mine a few years ago. They've stayed in touch, and I was lucky to get to know Ying a little bit this year. Ying was born in Taiwan, had a fairly traditional Taiwanese upbringing, interacted with Taiwanese culture, Taiwanese pastimes and pursuits. But a few years ago, she spent some time abroad and discovered the pastime of bodybuilding. Deeply non-traditional Taiwanese pastime. Since she's been home, she's been deepening her affinity and knowledge of this pursuit through the internet, predominantly Wikipedia and Facebook and Google. And as you can see, she's now crafting really quite a strong sporting identity for herself through something that even a few years ago, she would never have had the chance to do. This starts to talk to the importance of the internet. This is one of the things the internet does. It tears down the historical and social and cultural boundaries that might have kept someone like Ying from something like bodybuilding. The internet will rewire the world in other ways as well. I believe that, I mentioned a moment ago that 60% internet penetration will represent a more important threshold than 50%. And I hope this chart will help me explain why. What you're looking at here is the year 2002, and a selection of countries in the world scaled for population size over here. And plotted vertically on the y-axis, we have internet penetration in each market. So how many people, what proportion of that population are using the internet? And horizontally, in that market, per capita, what do brands spend on digital media? Okay? So in 2002, internet penetration was low, under 60% in almost all parts of the world. And accordingly, as you'd expect, investment in digital media was low as well. So keep your eye on the slide. And as I roll this forward, what you'll see is that every time a community of human beings, a nation, has passed 60% internet penetration, investment by brands in digital media has gone up exponentially. 60% seems to have this inherent, profound quality to it. It's the point at which brands invest in digital like never before. And as we've heard today, as the trust and transparency and efficacy, maybe, of platforms like Facebook and Google are increasingly called into question, it seems likely to me that the organizations who stand to benefit from a shift like this are those who have direct, engaged relationships with audiences in brand-safe environments like sports rights holders. What does this look like on the ground? A story I wanted to share was that of Nico. Nico's 20 and lives in Zurich. He filled in a survey for us this year. Again, he was comfortable that I share some of his details with you. As a 20-year-old, Nico spends a lot of his time on YouTube. So we asked him some questions around what he watches and what ads he sees and what does that do to his psychology. we asked Nico some questions about which categories he felt had most aggressively followed him around the internet. Which ads did he most frequently see? You know, the 5-second skippable pre-rolls that you get on YouTube. And he had this vague sense that it was banks. Banks have been aggressively trying to sell him a student account, all the banks that are active in Switzerland. He was vaguely aware of some of their names, but it didn't seem like the adverts had particularly resonated with him. I don't think he'd mind me saying that. He certainly wasn't considering taking out an account with any of them anytime soon. But where things got really interesting for me was when we started to ask Nico about why he was on YouTube in the first place. He was there, among other things, to watch some content, some highlights and behind-the-scenes coverage of the Swiss national football team, who, of course, have a banking partner, Credit Suisse. And when you probe the impact that that content's had on him and the uplift that that's delivered in his awareness and consideration and purchase intent around that brand, those metrics outperformed all of those associated with the other brands that had been targeting him with pre-rolls. This is what sport sponsorship's correction looks like on the ground. Sponsorship dollars outperforming media dollars. Which brings me to my final question of today, and I guess in some senses the most important one, which is how will rights owners grow their revenue in this next period? How do the new behaviours of people like Dhruv and Ying and Mike and Abanar and Nico, how do they change the way that sports rights owners can make their money? And of course, historically, we as rights owners have made our money three main ways: media rights, sponsorship rights, and event day rights. And there's very little evidence that that fact in itself will change in the next 10 years, but I think what will change will be the models and the mechanics by which we commercialise each of those revenue lines. So what I'd like to do for the last 5 minutes or so is offer to you a sketch, a data-driven sketch of what each of these revenue lines might look like and how it might change in the years ahead. Starting with media rights. So for a typical sports rights owner today, a media rights business might look something like this. We have lots of media businesses in the world, but actually we only have formal commercial direct relationships with a fairly small number. And we call these businesses our broadcast partners. Our relationships with them centre around, almost overwhelmingly, live event coverage. That's the core asset that we sell to these businesses. Outside of that relatively small tier of broadcast partners, we have this whole ecosystem, this multitude of other media platforms and publishers and businesses who write about us. They create content about us. They deliver reach for us and our partners. Many of them carry our content if we offer it to them. But they're non-fee paying media businesses. We have few mechanisms to capture value from them. What I would suggest is likely to happen in the years ahead is that a media rights business for a sports rights owner might evolve in this manner. Notice the differences. It seems reasonable that rights owners will find ways to better commercialize different types of content, diversified away from simply just live event coverage. We'll be able to grow our media rights revenues through other content assets. Behind the scenes, documentaries, feature films, clips, near live, shoulder content, widgets, and games. All of these things have the opportunity to drive growth into our media rights businesses. Accordingly, we'll have more media partners if that comes to be true, because we have more media assets at our disposal to sell to them. Average package value may stay static, it may go down, but will grow through a greater number of partners, a greater number of media partners, stratified across more levels, because we'll have different levels of inventory. We'll service our most premium media partners with our most premium inventory and create a hierarchy from there to reflect the different levels of value that each of our content assets delivers to those businesses in question. In this way, media rights businesses can grow because of fragmentation, not despite it, because of it, because consumers have an appetite to consume all these different executions of sport, not just the live event anymore. We can diversify the types of media rights we sell and grow through fragmentation. Of course, in parallel, we'd expect every rights owner in the world to bolster out their direct-to-consumer proposition. Many of us have direct-to-consumer propositions already. we just call them our websites. Today, they tend to operate mostly as editorial platforms with some e-commerce. Over the next 10 years, we'd expect most sports rights owners and most sports content owners to turn those into genuine premium content destinations. So that as we're growing our media rights models, we have a strategic hedge and a strategic outlet to build more direct relationships with more fans around the world, capture data around them, and use that data to grow other revenue lines. The picture I'm painting here is good news for rights owners, for sure, but I think it's also good for consumers as well. The penultimate story I wanted to share today was about Brent. Brent went to primary school with a colleague of ours at Two Circles, and despite the picture, Brent spent a lot of his life disliking golf, actively disliking golf. He found the traditional broadcast presentation of golf to be a little bit fusty, a little bit inaccessible, a little bit dry. But a few years ago, a clip rights package started finding its way into his Facebook feed. And this clip-based execution of golf, this clip-based expression of golf, was a little bit more irreverent, a bit more cheeky, a bit more humorous. And it made Brent smile. For the first time, golf had made Brent smile. So over time, he started to be a little bit more receptive every time he saw it in his feed. He ultimately started seeking it out. He, in parallel, downloaded a game, a smartphone game, owned by an Australian golf rights owner. Culminating 2 years ago, his affinity for the sport led him to buy a set of golf clubs for the first time. And now Brent is actually what I would classify as a fairly traditional golf player, golf consumer. This is him on the links golf course at the New South Wales Sydney Golf Club. So in this way, this new diversification of our media assets is going to create new ways for us to talk to fans and hopefully recruit more fans into relationships with our businesses. Secondly, our sponsorship rights models. Today, many of you might recognize your own sponsorship model to look something like this. A fairly rigid hierarchy of commercial partners with a top tier in fairly clearly defined categories, perhaps a secondary or tertiary tier with contras and VIKs and things, in clearly defined categories, serviced with fairly templated, boilerplated rights packages. I believe that sponsorship rights businesses will have the opportunity to grow through their adaptability, their ability to break this structured hierarchical model, and to service brands with more bespoke and more agile rights packages. So if brand A comes to me as a rights owner and says, I want to reach a wide audience at shallow depth, I have the rights and the inventory and the audience relationships to be able to service that. But if brand B comes to me and says, I want to service or reach a niche audience with greater depth, with a more direct response focused campaign, I'm able to service that as well. So in this way, sponsorship rights businesses can grow through flexibility. Of course, those of you in Katie's session today will have already heard we'd expect average sponsorship rights package values to go up as we as a community get better at understanding and measuring and articulating the value of digital media as well as broadcast media exposure. And we'll redraw the categories. Different types of brand will be active in the sponsorship marketplace. Instead of a CPG brand, maybe I'll have a relationship with a direct-to-consumer subscription razor blade brand. But here, the growth in sponsorship will come through average package value, not in number of partners, as it did in media. Finally, our event day businesses. Event day businesses are inherently about the interface between customers and experiences. We have a customer base, and we service it with the experiences that we have within our portfolio, within our business. And represented in the room today, of course, we have a fantastic cross-section of the British and European rights holder community, with fantastic customer bases, with growing diversity. We're getting better with each year that passes at retaining them and addressing them. And we service them with an increasingly diverse portfolio of experiences, new formats, new ways of consuming, new ways of attending. But what I think will define the next 10 years of our sporting planet is diversification at a scale that we maybe today can't even fathom or imagine. We'll have larger customer bases as we start to design for and service and monetize segments that we've historically maybe underserviced. Our audiences will get bigger through diversity, and we'll diversify the types of experience that we service them with. Not just through new tournaments and new formats of our games, but also by changing what it means to experience something live, by merging physical and digital together and changing what it means to be at a sports event and consume it in the moment. Which brings me to my final story that I wanted to share with you today. This is a woman called Lucy. Lucy is 30 and lives in East London. And I know Lucy quite well because she's my sister. She's not the most tech-savvy person in the world, bless her, nor is she the biggest sports fan, but certainly by the standards of today or of this room. But I wanted to tell you about her because a few weeks ago, Lucy took part in a closed beta trial run by an organisation developing hardware to augment and enrich live entertainment experiences through digital, through wearables and phones and headsets. Sport among them. And she phoned me up afterwards, and she told me that she'd had her eyes opened. It had changed her perception of sport. She couldn't believe how real it felt, how rich it felt, how exciting it felt. Sports that she historically has had very low affinity for, very low engagement with, suddenly were all she wanted to talk about. Knowing that I work in sport, she actually phoned me up to ask if I could get her any free tickets for sport this summer. So if anyone can help me out there, that would be appreciated. Joke. So I was listening to her, and I heard this story on two levels. I heard it at the level of Lucy herself. And again, I was encouraged and optimistic that technology and the way sport's changing is finding new ways to talk to people who historically maybe haven't engaged with our properties quite so much. But I heard it on another level as well, which was the level of Lucy's son, my 11-month-old nephew, Frankie, who's going to grow up in a world where this stuff's just normal. He'll grow up in a world where he won't be able to tell the difference between the physical and the digital. He'll be surrounded by screens and devices, but he might not know what a device is because it'll be everything. We will have rewired what it means to consume live sport, and I'm convinced and optimistic that it's for the better. Which was what led me to include that anecdote for you today. So where does this leave us? Sports rights owners have opportunity for structural growth, underlying systemic growth like never before, because of structural changes happening in the world, as well as the increase in sports' uniqueness and its appeal relative to other forms of entertainment. The media rights parts of our businesses will grow through fragmentation, or at least will have the opportunity to grow through fragmentation. As we develop more media relationships, more commercial media relationships, capture more of the value in the media ecosystem that goes around us and our properties. Sponsorship models will have the opportunity for growth through flexibility, to service brands in different ways, to break out of the historic boilerplated sponsorship packages that we've historically been shackled to. And event day rights businesses will grow through diversification of both customers and of the experiences that we give them. And that's largely where I wanted to leave you today. I've shared a bunch of data and 7 or 8 stories. I hope I've found a middle that worked for you, somewhere between the micro day-to-day truisms of what sport feels like today and the macro data sets, one of the biggest sports consumption data sets ever assembled, that drove much of the data that I've shared with you today. A final thought for you, that this sporting planet, if I've convinced you that's what it is ours. And for now, at least, it's the only one we've got. But it is ours. It's ours to look after, and ours to enjoy, and ours to shape together. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.